Kinesiology 223, still in chapter 2. This is presentation 3 out of 6. For this, we're talking cardiac morphology, talking about how the heart is made, how the blood flow goes through the actual heart itself, and then tying it into an electrocardiogram. We'll do a basic overview of just the P, the QRS complex, and the T, and you'll see how they tie into heart contraction. And it's actually something that you'll need to remember for later on when we start to talk about partial pressures of oxygen tied into cardiac phases, as well as blood pressure rates that are tied into cardiac phases. So make sure you take some time to at least commit some of this to memory. All right, so when you look at the construction of the heart, you have 4 chambers, 2 of which are kind of staging chambers and 2 of which are pumping chambers. The 2 that are staging are on top. They're called the atrium. And if you've ever walked into like an entry of a hotel or an entry of a building and there's a big glass ceiling above you, that's called an atrium. And so the way I remember this in undergrad was the atrium were the ones on top, like the big glass ceiling. That's these guys right here, and this one right over in here. And you can see you have these different valves, one here, one here, one here, and there's another one tucked in there that are one here, and I'm sorry, one here, if I can get my mouse to work right. That help close and open, open and close to help block blood flow to keep from backwashing into the previous valve. Different story, different class. So the upper 2, which are the atrium, those are for staging the blood. And then the bottom 2 are the ventricles. The ventricles are for pumping the blood, and they actually have a mechanical apparatus to them that causes that pumping action. Yeah, the cardiac, the layer of cardiac muscle that you have within the heart itself is called the myocardium, myomuscle, cardium for cardiac. And it's pretty easy to put together. Now, we'll get into a little bit further detail regarding SA node, a little bit of the AV node, and then also Purkinje fibers, and you have bundle of His as well, and then the actual branches of the Purkinje fibers that cause the heart on the bottom to contract, and it kind of contracts in a ring, so it pushes the blood through the heart and out to the body. So the heart itself, it has its own pacemaker, basically. It's called the SA node. That's this guy right on the top. SA is short for sinoatrial node. So it's within the atrium, right? So sinoatrial, and it's a sinus, if you will, like a small little node that's in there that is where the actual heart contraction starts. And it's kind of referred to its own little pacemaker for the heart. And when you hear people who need a pacemaker, it's because their SA node is not firing correctly. Also, you have another type of node that's called the atrioventricular node, and that AV node helps the timing between the top and the bottom chambers to be coordinated to fire correctly. I mean, if it's not firing correctly and you're dumping blood into here and there's already blood in here, you're not going to be able to push blood out as much as possible. Or if you've already pushed blood out of here and then the SA node fires and allows for blood to drop in here, the timing's off, you end up not having effective blood flow. So the SA node and the AV node have to work together to be able to take the electrical current that's in the heart from the SA down to the AV within the internodal pathways and down to the Purkinje fibers, and be able to distribute that electrical current in an orderly fashion that allows for the contractile mechanism to happen so blood can service the rest of the body. So there's, when you look at cardiac muscle itself, it's just unlike muscle fiber, like regular muscle fiber striated, it only has one nucleus and depolarizes involuntarily. So it tells you that something a little bit different about how the central nervous system interacts with the heart as opposed to the rest of the body. Now, you do have a little bit of control if you want to create a stress response, or you have a little bit of control if you want to work on some mind-body connections to be able to reduce the heart rate, which are some things that athletes do to be able to have a little bit more control of the autonomic nervous system, and you quiet that fight or flight and you get into rest and digest. If you remember the conversation about sympathetic nervous system versus parasympathetic nervous system. I'm going to kind of skip over that and not get into it too much right now because we'll see it later on. So the SA node itself is a pacemaker of the heart. We already talked about that. It generates that electrical impulse that spreads across the atrium and down to the AV node. It's carried down into the bundle branches to the Purkinje system, the Purkinje fibers themselves. it's a series of fibers that kind of surround everything around the ventricles, and that's what causes a contraction. Now, what's important to note is the timing of this. I mean, all that happens in a fraction of a second, and it happens in a less of a fraction of a second or a smaller fraction of a second, depending upon the demands placed upon the circulatory system to deliver blood to the rest of the body. If we're in a exercising state, then this number will change. If we're in a rested state, then this number will change, both either to a smaller and smaller amount of time in between firing or a much higher amount between firing rates. But you got to understand that the actual process to go from the SA node to the internodal pathways to the AV node, that itself is something that has a limiting factor. The central nervous system can only send impulses so fast. And if you're in a heightened exercise state and you require greater contractile mechanisms or greater contractile response, the mechanism that does that has limited ability to increase that firing rate. It has within a certain degree, but it's not like it can go from 0.2 seconds down to 0.02 seconds. It's just not something that happens because there's a limiting factor in how fast that electrical impulse can travel down the nervous system to fire. I just want to make sure you have that and you understand that that's kind of your limiting factor in this whole process. Now, we talked about deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood. We talked about partial pressure, and we talked about the red line and the blue line. If we look at this and we go, okay, we know blood ends up in this part of the heart, the right atrium. Now, it's right, even though it's the left side of your screen, because when we look at renderings of the human body, we look at it as if you're looking at the person. So if I'm staring at a person's chest and I look at their heart, this would be on the right side of their body, not the right side of my perspective. So that's why you look at this and you go, that's the right atrium, though it's on the left side of the screen. When you talk with people and you look at their chest, their heart's in the middle of their chest, the right atrium is going to be on the right side of their body. All right. So we know deoxygenated blood comes back to the heart, and it comes back to the heart through two main mechanisms. One is the inferior vena cava, and the other is the superior vena cava. And let me back one. And what you have is with the superior inferior vena cava, the name kind of tells a tale. Superior versus inferior, superior, inferior. One is above, one is below. Vena, it's named after what it does. It returns blood to the heart, so it's a vein. Arteries take blood away from the heart. That helps. Arteries away, AA. Veins to the heart. And then cava, it was named cava, so named because it's a very large opening like a cave. So superior vena cava. Upper mechanism or tube that brings blood to the heart, and it's big like a cave. Inferior, it's below the heart, vena cava. That's where the terminology comes from. Now we know that when blood returns to the heart, it's at the lowest pressure and flow rate when entering the right atrium, because it's gone through the entire system, and as it's gone through the entire system, it's come back to the station. We know we have the red line. We transition, we go to the blue line, and when it gets to the blue line and everything comes back to the heart itself, this is where the pressure in the vascular system is the lowest. But conversely, when we have this contraction, very forceful contraction out of the left ventricle, and it squirts blood out, and it goes to service the rest of the body, you have blood up here in the aorta, which is the main exit, if you will, of the blood of the heart, and you have blood is then shunted up to service the upper part of the body, and blood is shunted down to service the lower part of the body. So you have, this is where the highest blood pressure is found and where you have the highest amount of oxygen concentration, or the highest partial pressure of oxygen is found, is in the aorta. So looking at it just kind of in real basic terms here, get my mug out of the way. You have superior and inferior vena cava, goes into the right atrium, goes into the right ventricle, goes into the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. From the lungs, it goes to the pulmonary veins. Notice the difference there, right? Arteries, now veins. You're taking blood away from the heart. You're sending it to the lungs. Notice pulmonary infers lungs. So you're going away from the heart to the lungs via the pulmonary arteries. It gets to the lungs, and once it leaves the lungs and it goes back to the heart, it goes back much like the superior inferior vena cava. It goes back through the pulmonary veins, which these are these guys right here. They're red pulmonary veins from the right lung, pulmonary veins from the left lung. And then it goes into the goes into the left atrium, which is the staging area up top, goes into the left ventricle, which is this area down here. It goes squish out through and into the aorta, and then off it goes to the rest of the body. So real rudimentary kind of look at how blood comes down and into the lungs and goes out of the lungs back to the heart, and then services the rest of the body. And that's a constant blue line, red line process that happens thousands of times a day. Now, underlying all this is while you have the heart, as we talked about through the SA node, it's all run by electrical impulse, and the SA node is your pacemaker. And the entire system, whether it's the SA node, atrioventricular node, or it is the fundamental hist, the Purkinje fibers, they all run off of electrical impulses. And these are usually recorded like in a clinical setting. You'll see people wearing like a 12 lead echocardiogram lead where they have like a little electrodes all over them. And those are reading the electrical current in the heart from different perspectives. It's very much like if you look at your car from the front, from the side, from the back, from the top, and from the bottom. It gives a 360 view of the heart. And what you have now is through wearables, you can really get a pretty accurate read on this without having a 12 lead, but still that's what you see in a clinical setting more often than not. So the electrical current is represented in millivolts on an ECG lead. So with the electrocardiogram, these are the millivolts, these little squares here, up and down. And then when you look at this, each small square is 0.4 seconds. So as I'm going from left to right, it's 0.4 seconds, 0.4 seconds, 0.4 seconds, 0.4 seconds, 0.4 seconds. And with an EKG or ECG lead, you have 5 squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and there's usually a darker embossed line that tells you every 5th square or every 0.2 seconds. So when you're reading a lead quickly, you can see, okay, how many QRS complexes or how many R's more accurately do you see within each 5 squares, each 10 squares, and then you can quickly mathematically count out just how many beats a person has in a minute. And now if we look at each square over here in the y-axis, each square represents 1/10 of a millivolt. So 10 squares equals 1 millivolt. So like if you look at this QRX is 1 square, 2 squares, so that gives us 2/10 or 1/5 of a millivolt, right? So if you ever want to know in terms of the millivolts versus the time, it is 1/10 of a millivolt, and over here it's 2/10 of a second. We evaluate these more than anything else. I mean, also when you get into exercise testing and you start evaluating people, you look at how that R looks. Because if you have something like a bundle branch block where it's not firing correctly and it's a delayed response from one side of the heart to the other side of the heart, this will almost look like a mesa or a plateau. But right now you can see this is a nice solid QRS complex, nice and tight with really very little delay on either leg of that QRS. So this is a pretty good normal sinus rhythm. It actually is a little bit tachycardic, but we'll just kind of roll with this for right now. So the parts that you have are the P wave, which is this guy down here. You have the QRS complex, which is this. You have the T wave, and now each one represents something happening in the heart. The P wave, that shallow bump, is the time when the SA node depolarizes. The QRX is when the ventricles of the heart depolarize. And you can understand why, right? It's a lot of muscle that's contracting to squish the blood. So you're going to have a larger deflection of electrical current. And then a T wave is when the ventricles repolarize after they've squished the blood out, right? But we focus a lot of time on R to R. And you'll see as we go into this a little bit deeper, we're going to talk more about that R to R. But I'm going to sign off right now and get on to the next presentation.